Hello, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta. I'm recording this video for the Soc 350 Sociology of Gender course as part of exam review. We're getting ready for the first exam, and I said, hey, send me messages with questions by Saturday, and on Sunday I'm going to record a review video. So using that Google form, I got two questions. One of them's very simple and one of them's a little bit more involved. So let's talk about the first one. Will material from the book and material from your lectures be included in the questions? Also, will there be questions about academic integrity? There sure could be questions about academic integrity. It is an assigned reading, and it's all readings and all lectures. I want you to master the concepts of both. Usually the concepts regarding the lectures have something to do with what's in the text, but they don't overlap. I expect you to know both. And I do want you to remember academic integrity stuff. So I'm certainly going to tell you that it could be on the test. I'm not going to tell you whether it is or not, but it could be. Okay, here's a more involved question. By the way, that material, that the answer to that question is also on the syllabus. Always look at your syllabus. Okay, second question. In lecture 2, this person writes, you talked about transsexual as being a dated word, and indeed I included a video that had used the word transsexual from about 10 years ago. And this student then writes, as I understood it, it initially meant being trapped in the wrong physical body, while being transgender, as opposed to transsexual, meant the feeling of being trapped playing the wrong gender role, to oversimplify it. When people use the word transgender now, here comes the question, does it mean both playing the wrong gender role and being trapped in the wrong biological body? Can it be either or has it just come to replace the word transsexual? Good question. I was a little confused by the way it was written. Says the student, I've heard the word used in the modern context to mean feeling trapped in the wrong physical body, but have never heard it to mean playing the wrong gender role in the modern context. So I was not sure if it still applies or not. In terms of this class, which word should we use to describe what? Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. This makes it a really good question, and I want to thank the student for answering that question, or asking the questions. So, first of all, the idea of wrong versus right gender. Let's make sure that by that we don't mean like morally right or morally wrong. The Sociology of Gender course is not about making moral judgments, ourselves as students and as faculty member, about what's right and wrong, what's preferable versus not preferable for everybody else, but instead studying how it is, the processes by which people come to understand their situation and the situation of others, to set expectations and enforce those through gender policing, to play with those through gender innovation, to experience the diversity through things like cultural traveling, right? And so notice that the sociology of gender, being a sociology class and not a biology class, or even a psychology class, is really interested in social structures, which are patterns of interaction, and ways in which that affects a variety of human experiences at the social level, meaning interaction between individuals, membership in groups and categories, the formation of institutions, and things like that. So this course is really cultural. Okay, number one. And I'm assuming that the student, when you're asking this question, it's within that context, right? Both in terms of right, wrong, and in terms of this cultural turn. In this class, we're interested in that cultural aspect, much more than we are interested in the biological. The idea of biology, right, is that about gender or is that about sex? In sociology, we really distinguish between those two, where sex is about our ideas of biology, and gender is about our ideas of social expectations for others, okay? So If sex and gender are really different, then transgender and transsexual really mean different things. And let's take a step back from saying which one is right, which one is real, and let's take that sociological cultural turn to say what really matters is studying the terms themselves and the fact that those are themselves cultural creations of their historical moments, right? Okay, so uh, what it means is when I say this is an outdated word, transsexual, it means that it's a word that was used a lot more often in the past than it is now. And it's a word that has been largely supplanted in the sociological literature by the word transgender, because transgender is about the experience of transcending a gender category. What gender category? The gender category to which uh, you were assigned when you were born. Now, the idea is, if we look into the most common definition of transgender, it means that one's gender is not aligned with the gender that is expected for people who have the sex that you were assigned at birth. The idea of transgender means that, okay, first of all, we're all born. Yay, congratulations. Second, when a person is born, and it's usually considered unproblematic sexing when there's a straightforward biological category of sex, and it's a more problematic, troublesome categorization and assignation when someone is born intersex. But the idea is that people are assigned a sex at birth, um, right? And sometimes uh, genetics and hormonal experience and physical characteristics and things like that all line up, and sometimes they don't. And that happens in interesting ways. And nevertheless, we seem to resolve culturally the idea of sex is done into two categories, right? And they correspond to two gender categories, masculine and feminine, although we've started to learn that there are actually many variations along those themes. um, that's the predominating force, right? People get born, they get assigned a sex, and there's gender expectations associated with those. When someone takes a gender role or a gender identity that is no longer matching that, the gender role associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth, we call that person transgender, right? Uh, it implies that there's another possibility, which is that someone is assigned a sex at birth, and then they have gender expectations that are associated with them. And if they fulfill those gender expectations and their identity is one that is in line with those expectations, then we have a word for that, which is cisgender, C-I-S gender, and that means in alignment with, as opposed to in opposition to, which is trans. So that is a really different cultural idea than transsexual, because the word transsexual, as it was typically defined during the latter half of the 20th century, had to do with the idea that people have a biological sex and people have a sense of their sex that is different than the sex in which they were born. Okay, it doesn't have inside it the idea, transsexual, that people are assigned sex, right, by our society, that sex is a cultural idea. No, it's taken to be a biological idea. And what the disorder of transsexualism, right? Because this is conceived of as a body dysmorphia, a body disorder, is one in which individuals are born into a sex unproblematically, but their experience inside their heads of the sex that they actually are does not line up with that. It's all about sex, it's not about gender. So it means something different. It's a different contention about how this whole thing is organized. It's not about gender. Gender doesn't enter into that. And then, so the question is, well, what do you do about that? Do you modify the body? This is the typical model for transsexual, or the presentation of the body. Do you manage to somehow bring into alignment, or does a person learn to pass? Which is, although they may have an identity regarding their sex that does not match the sex at birth, do we nevertheless have individuals try to kick that identity to the curb and adopt the dominant sexual identity to which they are expected to conform? So those are two really different ways of thinking about sex and gender and the idea of trans. Transsexual is all about the experience of bodily sexuality and sexual identity. And transgender is all about being assigned a sex, saying it assumes that sex is this thing that is assigned to people, number one, because there are a lot of people that don't have an unambiguous sex, and nevertheless, even so, sometimes people are assigned sexes that correspond in some ways not to their biology. Second, that there's social expectations associated with those, and that what is being transgressed upon or transcended, all kinds of trans words, the transportation you make in your life across this line is regarding gender expectations. Now, you can do those messing with gender expectations in a number of ways, right? It can be about clothes you wear. It can be about makeup you do or don't put on your face. It can be about drugs you take that can alter your appearance. It can be about bodybuilding in particular ways to change the shape of your body. It can be about your haircut. It can be about the shoes you wear. It can be about surgery. It doesn't have to be about surgery, the notion of transgender, and it opens up a lot of possibilities. It includes the possibility of there being more genders. Someone who wants to escape the gender system doesn't simply have to move from, okay, this sex of male to the sex of female, or the sex of female to the sex of male. But if you're talking about gender, well, gender is about social expectations and social identity. You could construct an entirely new identity that is neither the gender identity of masculine or the gender identity of feminine. You can create an entirely new one, a gender identity of camp, or a gender identity of butch, or a gender identity of twink or emo, or you can go on and on and on. There are so many different words for these, so many possible gender identities out there that some of them, then people can say, I'm not binary, which means I don't identify exclusively as masculine or feminine. Maybe I identify as something else. Maybe I identify as a combination of the two. Transgender is much more open as this umbrella term, and it can include gender queerness, as opposed to where there may be people who are sexually, they might call themselves straight, but they might be genderqueer. It can include expression of sexuality. It can include all kinds of cultural innovation that people can do. It can include the notion of fluidity, which is that individuals are making sometimes choices about the selves that they choose to build and manifest to show to the world. It has a much more open set of connotations than transsexual, which is thinking about it as an issue regarding the disjuncture between a body and the idea of this is the body you were born into and that's that, and the mind and the mind's perception of itself and its mismatch with the body. Much more straightforward tale. Sociologists in the 1980s and 1990s began to start to question this. In addition to people in the humanities, there's the field of gay studies, queer studies that comes up and begins to question this, which is why the new term transgender starts to be used with its different set of assumptions and different set of connotations, meaning something really different. I want to show you for a moment the transition, and you can see this in two ways. Okay, first we're going to look at Google Books, which has a really handy dandy search engine called books.google.com/n, as in the letter N, like Nancy, grams, like grams of carbohydrates or something like that. But we can go to that website and we can look up here in this ngram viewer. We can put two terms in, like transsexual and transgender, and you'll notice, okay, first of all, what we're seeing here is the relative occurrence of transgender and transsexual in English language books. How many of them? Millions of them that occur between 1950 and 2008, when unfortunately Google stopped cataloging all the books and going through and getting these phrases and words in there. But you'll notice that before 1960, transgender and transsexual just don't appear at all. Then transsexual, which is the blue line, starts to appear in the mid-1960s, really takes off in the 70s, and goes up in the 80s and 90s until it starts to relatively descend after the year 2000. This is when the idea of sexual identity is starting to be noticed a lot more, talked about a lot more, decriminalized a lot more. It used to be criminal to be non-normatively sexual. So in the 1960s, in the United States at least, that begins to change. And so the idea of beginning to talk about it in books, it becomes more popular, and the term transsexual comes out. But it's still sexually oriented, and the idea of biological sex is the thing in which it's based. Then you notice this turn. There's a few books in there in the late 1980s, but this red line really in the 1990s and then in the 2000s really takes off to the point where in about 2002, people start using the word transgender in books more often than they use the word transsexual. Okay, now if we want to think about this third term, cisgender, CIS gender, right? If we're searching from between 1950 and 2008, something's going to happen, which is that we're going to get this error message that says, hey, we're not finding this term, which really means for Google Books, not that there's no reference, but that there's so few that they don't have the ability to chart it because they don't have statistical confidence in its relative occurrence. It's just not there, even when we go up to the year 2008, which is really interesting because the word cisgender is one that is often used now, especially among young people. When people call into shows, they'll say, hi, I'm a cisgender, straight male in my 30s, and blah, blah, blah. Will you give me this advice? You hear it all the time nowadays. So this is stopping looking in 2008. What can we find out about cisgender in the time period before then? Well, if we look at another reference, which is Google Scholar, okay, which is not looking at books, but is looking at academic journal articles. In the years, you notice you can go to scholar.google.com, you can do a search through these academic journal articles in the custom year range of 2010 to 2019. There are 15,800 results. That's a lot of studies. What about the 10 years beforehand, 2000 to 2009? 157 results. Okay, let's just look at that again. 2010 to 2019, 15,800. Okay, and then we go in the 10 years earlier, 157, which is like 100 times less. And if we look in the decade prior, right, this is about when Google Books stops. If we go to 2000, 2008, it's 105, which indicates that in the year of 2009, which is the year after Google Books stops, of the 157, a whopping 61 results are available then. What about if we go down to 1990 to 1999 or 2000 or so? Yeah, 1999. I think that's parallel to the searches we were doing before. Only 16 results. And if we look from 1950 to 1989, for that entire 49 years, 11 results. So that's a big deal. It indicates that the whole idea of cisgender as opposed to transgender, which if we look during this period of 2000 to 2009, it appears afterward, okay, which is really interesting. So during the period of, 2000 to 2009, we have 39,400 results for transgender, but during that same period for cisgender, there we go. We only have 157. Wow. Okay, so that indicates that first, the transgression, the transportation across the social lines, the transformation, whatever you want that trans to refer to, that difference is noticed first, and there's not even a word yet that's being used hardly at all to refer to, well, we have to notice the construction of the alliance of gender identity and expectations and how those two often align. In the years since, right? So if we say from 2010 to 2019, if we look at cisgender, let's look at cisgender first, and then let's look 2010 to 2019. We'll get 15,800 results. And what about transgender? 111,000 results. So still there's a lot more noticing of the difference and not of the alignment of expectations with identity as cisgender, but now it's at a level of 10 references to transgender for every 1 reference to cisgender. What's happening is that the sociological study of gender and other studies of gender are beginning to notice that, cisgender identities, that is when someone is assigned, say, female at birth, and they're expected to be feminine, and they actually engage in feminine gender role expression, that is also construction. It is also work. So notice in the readings in your gender textbook by Lisa Wade and Myra Marks Fareed that they talk about the fact that actually achieving cisgender status is itself an accomplishment as well. How do we know it's an accomplishment? Because, boy, there's a lot of social work put into making sure little people who are identified as girls and little people who are identified as boys know what colors they're supposed to like, what toys they're supposed to like, what food they're supposed to like, what activities they're supposed to like, what sports they're supposed to like, what hygiene practices they're supposed to engage in, and that they're different. And we notice gender policing all over the place as well, which is, to review the concept from your text, the social reactions that people get when they transgress the expected social role to push them back in. Okay, this is a little bit perhaps more detailed of an answer than that student might have wanted to look for, but really there's a lot in there to unpack and to consider. The really interesting recency of the terms, and yet the ubiquity now of these terms, transgender and cisgender, as opposed to transsexual, which was this really popular transsexual, we search for that. Now we know there are 19,800 results in the last decade, when there are 10 times as much in the last decade for transgender. It is waning in terms of its recognition. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't recognize that those two terms existed. They passed one another, and in so doing, changed the way we think about people who don't fit in. I hope this has been helpful in your review and in your thinking about the sociology of gender, and I wish you a lot of luck in studying for that exam. And I really am looking forward to what you have to say when I ask you these questions and you get ready with an answer.